What's up everybody, JJ here, and today we're going to be replacing a lot of the cable chains on my Anycubic Mega S. I've had a lot of requests for a video covering the installation and just sort of covering this entire mod because it isn't super straightforward, and I do have to replace a lot of these that I originally printed in PLA, and since I was planning on replacing these anyways, I thought this is a great time to go ahead and take it apart and show you the whole setup, the whole process. So let's go ahead and get right into it. The first question you may ask is, do you really need the cable chains? Maybe. I would say you need it on the y-axis. The bed cable chain, I would call that a priority. Pretty much for any 3D printer, you want to make sure there's good strain relief on the cables that are going to heat your bed. There's a lot of power that runs through those, and on the Anycubic Mega S, I would call it nearly critical flaw that it's just fed up through a metal hole. I mean, they're in a big PVC sleeve, but every time the bed moves forward and back, which is so many times during a print, it rubs against that hole. And after I'd been printing for about 6 months, I noticed that PVC sheathing was already starting to wear away, which is kind of scary. That's kind of a fire risk. So you need some sort of strain relief on it. And this is a really great way to do it. I also like printing your own cable chains because it's a nice fun pop of color or style you can add to any printer. Make it your own, and this is a great way to do it. So I think it is important to cover what materials you should print these out of. I would recommend printing in the highest temperature filament you're going to use. So if you're printing ABS, or if you ever do print ABS, I would recommend reprinting your bed mount, or if you've gotten PETG working, and I have a video that could help you out, then I would recommend printing them in that. If you only print PLA, I think you should be fine with that. I did get some pretty bad warping on the ones I printed in PLA, but that's because I was printing ABS on here. So the bed was heated to 95 degrees Celsius, and some of the cable chains started to deform. But if you are only printing PLA, I think you can print these cable chains in PLA and you should be fine. Another thing to mention about these cable chains is you don't need all of them. I would highly recommend the y-axis chain, but other than that, you can just leave it there and leave the default for everything else. The other one I do really like is the x-axis chain. Instead of that big, ugly, wrapped thing that was coming from the x-axis over to the extruder, I do really like how this one looks, and then you do only have your single Bowden tube up here. It's kind of an aesthetic thing that I like this one more than that. And so you could do only the ones you want, and then leave the z-axis ones if they don't bother you. First thing, let's head to the computer. Let me show you how I sliced these STLs, how I laid them all out, and how many you all need. So here we are at the computer to slice these files. First, you'll need to download them from Thingiverse. I don't normally like using Thingiverse, but when there's amazing files on there, you gotta get them where you can get them. Down in the description, they do let you know how many you need. I did use 25 pieces for the x-axis instead of the recommended 23, but you could print 25 and then see how many you actually need. For me, 23 links in that chain seemed just a little bit tight, and when I extended the x-axis all the way to the side, it seemed like there was a little bit of force that the chain was trying to pull back on. So I used 25 and it seemed to work really well. Here's the recommended screws as well if you need to replace any. Also some cable ties if you would like to use those. Make sure they're not too wide. I'll link some that I use. Those are really small ones that I used on my Voron 0.1 build, but any small cable ties should work. So first you'll need to download all the files. Often with Thingiverse, if the download all files button doesn't work, go down to the Thing Files tab, and then you can download them all individually here. So once you have them all downloaded, we can go over to Cura and start importing them. You might want to try a test print to see if you can get one going down well, but after that, you can just take one and then multiply selected. This is on the Anycubic Mega S build plate. It's not going to all fit. So I split it into 2 sections of 24. I would recommend you turning down your initial speed. For me, I usually print at 100 millimeters per second. The initial layer speed is usually 50, but for this, since it's a lot of delicate small parts it's putting down, I would recommend slowing that down, maybe 30 or 25 even. Just make sure you bump it way down to get a nice slow first layer. Will make sure you get good adhesion. Build plate adhesion might also help you. I always do a skirt, which is just a line around the outside to get the nozzle flowing. But if you're having some bed adhesion problems, then a brim could work as well. Something like this. This is what it should look like. And so you'll print this file out twice. Another thing to note with the cable chain links, you don't put supports here because they will be really hard to remove. Do make sure you have adequate cooling. I bumped my cooling all the way up to 100% because this is a good test of your bridging capabilities on your printer. But that about covers it for the A link. Then you can import chain link C. With the C links, these are a lot smaller than the A links, so we're able to fit way more on the build plate at the same time. And these you want oriented in this way of the split being on the build plate. That'll make bridging the top section way easier. This will mean you have a lot of smaller pieces on your build plate, so I would recommend slowing down those initial layers for this one as well. And again, no supports for this print either. If you can get away without using a brim, I would recommend it, but if you need a brim, you have to do what you gotta do. But it will take a while to get all of those little support brim pieces off of all these little parts. When it comes to the Y-axis cable chain, there's two files you can select from. There's frame and there's frame V2. The V2 is for the Anycubic Mega S, and the regular frame is for the standard Anycubic if you've got the older model. You can just import all of these at once. So for the frame mounts, it is recommended that you use supports, and I would do them everywhere, not just touching build plate, because there are a lot of small parts here that do need supports. I like using support pattern lines because they're really easy to remove later. Not a very high density, something like 15. Let's slice it and see how it looks. I would also set your overhang angle something high like this, like 80. And then if you are planning on using zip ties, I would recommend going back in here, all the little holes where the zip ties would go through. And you should put in support blocks, because once those tiny holes get filled with supports, it's almost impossible to remove them really well at all. I would recommend doing one model, then going back, reslicing it, looking at each one, seeing how it's looking. Some of these, make sure to check the bottom of them as well. This one, I would put support blockers here on the bottom. It is a 90-degree overhang, but it's such a small piece. I think the bridging of my printer should be fine. Put in support blockers on those. Here's another section on this one. Make sure you're putting really small support blockers, because you want them here, but not on this part of the print. Reslice to just make sure things are working. Yep, that's exactly what I want. It's a lot of very different prints here, so make sure you're inspecting them beforehand. But this is looking pretty good right now. Let's send this over to the printer, get it printed, and then we can start installing them. Well, now that you've got them all sliced and printed, we can start the installation process. Let's start with the Y-axis, because that one's most important. Well, the first thing before we remove the bed, I would recommend you inspect your parts. So these are the types of imperfections we're gonna be cleaning up. You can just take your offset cutters there, scrape around those edges, and then it looks much better like this. Spending just a little bit of time on this right now can help greatly in the final installation process. And they'll all fit together really easily. But you can test them out as you're going, make sure it flexes really easily, make sure they all have a solid fit there. If any of them pop apart too easily like that, you can go back over them with a little knife, a little blade, can help clean up some of these joints to make sure things fit together really nicely. But once you have enough of these cleaned up, we can start with removing the print bed. Remove the head out of the way and fully remove your bed leveling screws. So you simply remove the bed leveling screws and then you can lift straight up. It would actually help if you move your Z-axis up with just a little bit of pressure. You can slowly slide it straight up. Or if your printer can be turned on, it'd be better if you just raise the gantry up. Easy, out of the way now. You can lift your printer straight up. Make sure you don't put too much stress on these solder joints, because it is just soldered to this heated bed. But underneath, you'll see these screws that we have. They're M3 screws, so I have an M2.5 hex head, and that should help for removing those screws straight out, and you can use the default ones, just putting them right back in. This silver part that I have installed here is already PETG, so I don't have to replace it right now. Then tighten them in. Don't go too tight. You really only need a snug fit. Then you can replace your bed. Now we can go around to the back to work on the cable chain. It's pretty easy to remove a previously installed one. You can just work the cable through the slots in each link. Over here where the cables enter the chassis, there's two holes here where you can mount this piece. You'll need to add your own screws and nuts on the other side, so you can use whatever you have. I think these are M3 by 8 millimeters. You can simply place them in there. We will have to get inside the chassis to put the nuts on the other side. When cutting the PVC sheathing on here, make sure you leave plenty of extra space. I can pull out a lot that I've just left inside the chassis, or I can slide it back down in there. But now that we have it together, this is all 16 links. Make sure you orient it correctly. The chain will bend in one way, but won't really bend in the other way. So we want the bend to match the natural way things are gonna go. And the chain and the cable will go around like this. Make sure you're not really forcing them in there, because these links could be sharp on these cables. It can help to go ahead and feed the thermistor wires. Those are the small ones. Feed the small ones in first, and then come back and get the big ones fed in there. Make sure you take your time with this. You really don't want to cut these sheathing. Now it's all in there. And then clip the chain onto the bed mount. And here, if you have any really small zip ties, and this is just an additional strain relief, holds them together, make sure nothing's rubbing. And now the last thing we need to do is get underneath to put these bolts on. So if you've never opened up the bottom of your printer, or even if you have, here's the best way I've found to do it. It's really not very scary. We're gonna take it safe, we're gonna keep it easy. First, you turn it around backwards. I take off the screen cover that I have on here. Make sure the power's fully unplugged and turned off. I'm gonna remove the Raspberry Pi since it kinda can get in the way. Remove any extra cables, so if you got the USB cables or anything else that it's gonna flop around, it makes it easier just to remove that. And then I just tip it forward and lean it up on the gantry like that. Now you need an Allen key. These are standard M3 bolts on here, so these are pretty common, and there's even an Allen key that came with the printer. And I never put these on very tight because I remove them fairly often, so just a slightly snug fit is fine for these. And then you need to remove this crossbar here, and you can just take out these two screws. There's one screw on each side. So then this middle piece is free, and you can just slide this up straight above it. I do have a bunch of wires here, so it's a bit more tricky, but I just rotate it out. Rotate like that, then it's up and out. I have all these extra wires for all the LEDs I've mounted on the printer, and I should have just made them longer, but it works like this. It's just a little more difficult to get in here. When it comes to things in here you don't want to touch, especially when it's powered on, but really in general to avoid the power supply wires over here and your power input over here. These are going to be 120 volts here in the US, 250 other places in the world. And these power supply lines here could also have some voltage. There's a little LED on the power supply that will let you know when the power supply has discharged. But in general, just avoid it. Make sure nothing falls inside of there. Unless you're comfortable around a power supply, I would say just avoid it and you'll be fine. The part we want to get to is right in here. There's two little screw holes in there that the screws will come right through. You can see them right there. And we can mount M3 bolts onto it. It's nice that these holes were pre-drilled on the chassis, almost like this thing is built for this. So once you've got them finger tight in there, you can take your Allen key to the other side, and you can use just some pliers or a socket, using something to hold the nut and then tighten it up on the other side. You do want these plenty tight enough because there will be a lot of vibrations on the y-axis shaking these nuts, so make sure they're just nice and secure. And that's pretty much all we need to do on the other underside. We can go ahead and put our chassis panel back on. Now you can make sure it covers the full length all the way back, all the way forward. The cable chain is nice and secure in place. It's not flopping around. And making sure it's not tugging in any weird ways on the cable. This is working great. And now we can move on to the other chains. Now for installing this, the left side Z motor mount, there's two M3 hex bolts in here holding on. They're actually holding up the X end stop here, and so we can just reuse the ones that are already on the printer. You don't need new ones here. Drop them down, and then the X end stop will come off as well, and you can just unplug that one, give it a little pull, and then that plug fits right through the mount. So now the old one's done, we can pull in the new one, and this makes seeing things a little bit easier because it's silver, not black. But you can feed this plug right through that hole again. But I guess before we do that, we can go ahead and take the whole cable chain off. That'll be easier to do right now. You don't have to remove the motor plug right here. On the other side of the printer, we will remove the motor plug, but this one can just feed through the chain. I'm gonna have to work it off the chain. This PLA one is starting to warp on the ends. It doesn't fit together as well. So we're replacing it with this PETG one. Also reprinting the black one so this teal color will match all the other cable chains on the entire printer. Do make sure you have the orientation for the mounts correctly, because it works this way. It's not reversible. The clips need to be clipped in there. On one of the other ones, I installed it backwards and then had to redo the entire thing. So just make sure you check your orientation. It's pretty easy to just feed it through this, zigzag it straight up the wiring there. And it's all installed. At the bottom, you can just clip it onto the mount. I realized I forgot to reprint this one, so I'll have to reinstall that one later. But it's nice and easy to get to because the two bolts are right here on top. Those bolts are already used to hold the motor to the frame, so you can just reuse those bolts. They might need slightly longer ones. If you're having trouble with any of the bolts fitting or they're not long enough to get a good grip, you can just replace them. You can get slightly longer standard M3 bolts. Now we're attaching the top mount. Feed the X in stop plug through the hole, then clip it back onto the X in stop. And then this one is a little fiddly to get all worked up. I found it's easiest to go ahead and get the bolts started on the printed mount. So then you can just line everything up. It is not the easiest thing to get all these holes lined up correctly. But once it's in there pretty secure, you can tell nothing's wobbling around. This isn't the most structural part, so pretty secure is fine enough. And you can mount the cable chain. This bottom mount is a little broken for me, but it can still hold it enough to demonstrate how it's working. And so you can run your Z-axis up and down. The base X mount over here as well mounts using the same screws that hold on this motor here. So you pull out just those two screws and you mount this piece onto the frame there. Nice and easy. Then you can feed up all of these cables heading upwards. This one is nice and wide. There's a lot of cables you have to feed through here, so do take your time. It takes quite a while to get them all fed up there correctly. Another tip I found is to do it in sections, so you can pull these apart a couple at a time. And that can help you feed just a few cable links at a time and then fit all these chain links together. That can make it just a little bit easier to feed them through. It is a snug fit getting all the way up to the extruder motor, but this is one trick I found so that way you don't have to extend the extruder motor wires here. Make the extruder motor plug come out of the cable chain. This is 6 links from the top. Just feed it straight over to the motor wire. Since it doesn't need to go all the way to the top and then feed out, you can simply pop it out there in the middle and head straight over to the motor. This is a motor plug you will need to remove to feed through the cable chain. And so you can simply pull off the hot glue that holds this motor plug together, and then I just put a dab of hot glue back on there to hold it in place. That's a little bit of strain relief for it. One of the hardest connections here was getting all the cables fed up and around this bend. I've got a second part printed here to explain it, but you need to feed all the plugs in through one hole and then out the other to head down the X cable chain. So it is a bit difficult getting them all fed through there correctly and making sure there's not too much stress on any of the parts. But once you get everything in there correctly, it's nice and secure. There's not too much stress on any of the wires. Now when it comes to the mount that mounts it to the X carriage, there's several different ways, and I don't have the stock hot end carriage on here anyways, so this is a mod someone else made to attach the cable chain to this hot end, but you can just use the one that came stock with these other chains to get it mounted to the stock hot end carriage. And that just about covers all you need to get all the cable chains up and running on your Anycubic Mega S. These models are really nice that they use mostly the screws that are already on your printer. You may need some slightly longer ones. I will link in the description a kit of just metric sized hex screws that I've used a lot on this printer. Whether you strip one, lose one, break one, whatever. This is a kit I've just bought a long time ago, and it's been sometimes really useful to have extra screws laying around that fit 3D printers. A few more things to note. I didn't use many zip ties on here for extra strain relief. Some of the mounts do have slots for small zip ties. I didn't feel like it needed it in a lot of places. The Y-axis bed mount was some of the only zip ties I did actually use on this print. But other than that, I feel like it didn't need additional strain relief. Another thing to note, soon after you install these, there can be a little bit of creaking. I feel like in the X-axis was the most creaking. Sounded like far off somewhere else in the house, a door was creaking, but it went away after about a week of printing on it, and now I really don't hear it anymore. So if you do notice that shortly after installing it, it did go away for me after a little while. But that about wraps it up for this video. Hopefully that answered some of the questions people were having. I had a lot of comments requesting this video, so I knew I had to cover it. And if you have any other video requests or things you're struggling with on your 3D printer or you want clarification for, I love for my videos to really be helping people with the issues they're having. So if you have any video ideas, let me know in the comments down below. But anyway, I hope this video has inspired you to go out there, make something amazing today, and I'll see you in the next one.